This is Carolina Ghost Towns, a podcast about the vanished towns and lost communities in South Carolina, North Carolina, and maybe a few other places. I'm your host, Tom Taylor. On rare occasions, as a teen, I got to go to Six Flags Over Georgia. Of course, I gravitated toward the more thrilling rides and roller coasters, but I also enjoyed the classics, like the log flume and Dahlonega mine train. These latter rides were two of the earliest, introduced to the park in 1967 and 1968. I knew that Dahlonega was a reference to a town in Georgia, but at that time I hadn't put it together with its association with the earliest gold rush in the United States. Today's ghost town is a part of that gold rush. Located a few miles south of Dahlonega in northern Georgia was the town of Auraria. Even its very name means gold. This town even has its own version of a log flume. A very real one, with an exciting detour through a tunnel with rapids. This town gave rise to another town of the same name, one that eventually became a mile-high city. But that's getting ahead of things.
Why, it's getting so a man can't earn a dishonest living no more.
There's gold in them dire hills.
That's a popular corruption of a phrase attributed to Mark Twain in his novel, The American Claimant. According to Georgia historian E. Merton Coulter, the phrase was first uttered by Dahlonega gold assayer Matthew Fleming Stevenson. The Cherokee and some early settlers knew about the gold deposits in the Georgia mountains, but it wasn't until 1828 when the gold rush began. In 1894, at the age of 94, Benjamin Parks said that he was out deer hunting and kicked up something which caught his eye. He examined it and concluded that it was gold. Soon the news got out, and in his words, quote,
"Such excitement you never saw. It seemed, within a few days, as if the whole world must have heard of it. For men came from every state I'd ever heard of. They came afoot, on horseback, and in wagons, acting more like crazy men than anything else."
Close quote. The problem was that all of northern Georgia was still Cherokee territory. Georgia passed several laws restricting the Cherokee to only the northernmost counties, and also limiting their participation in civic matters. In 1830, Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act, which forced the Cherokee to relocate to Oklahoma. A journey which became known as the Trail of Tears. But there's an even closer tie between Jackson's actions and the Georgia Gold Rush. John C. Calhoun from South Carolina was one of the early gold speculators and held an interest in a mining company. During this time, Calhoun was vice president under Andrew Jackson. He had a financial interest in seeing the Cherokee relocated. Even though Jackson signed the legislation that removed the Cherokee, which helped Calhoun's interests, he had a falling out with Calhoun over the issue of states' rights and nullification. Ironically, it was Georgia's actions regarding the gold region that provided one of the sparks of nullification. Georgia passed laws that essentially violated existing treaties with the Cherokee, asserting the state's right to pass such laws. Jackson first sent federal troops to enforce the treaty, but then withdrew them. The issue of nullification came to a head with South Carolina's refusal to abide by the Tariff of 1826 and threats to secede from the Union, led chiefly by Calhoun. Calhoun resigned as vice president in 1830 to take a U.S. Senate seat. All that political wrangling aside, the gold rush was now on, regardless of Cherokee claims to the land. The first prospectors came to a ridge between the Chestatee and Etowah rivers. William Dean built a cabin on the ridge in 1832, and soon other settlers followed. The burgeoning settlement was first called Dean, after its first settler. Shortly thereafter, Nathaniel Knuckles built a tavern in the area, and the place became known as Knucklesville. E. Merton Coulter states in his 1956 book, Auraria, the Story of a Gold Mining Town, that around Knuckles' Tavern, quote, a town would surely spring up, for back and sides might go bare, but miners must have strong ale. Soon there was drawn together a population, described by one who was there as composed of all classes and conditions of the human family, from the most indigent beggar to the wealthy nabob, close quote. Coulter goes on to say,
but all who came did not expect to dig their gold out of the ground. It was easier to get it from the miner who had got it by digging. This had been so long before Auraria ever grew up, and it would remain true long thereafter. Most miners had always dug their gold not to keep, but to spend, and all mining towns before, now, and henceforth had made, were making, and would make it easy for them to do so.
Close quote. And so a boom town sprung up along the ridge overlooking the rich gold fields. The town had 18 to 20 stores, 15 law offices, and 4 or 5 taverns to serve the 1,000 or so residents of the town. With so many seeking their fortune, it's no wonder there were almost as many lawyers as merchants. Disputes were bound to arise, sometimes turning violent. Knucklesville became known as Knucklesville, spelled like the knuckles on a fist, because of all the fights that broke out in taverns. Calhoun decided that Knucklesville was not a fitting name for an up-and-coming town, and elicited suggestions. Colonel Joseph J. Powell came up with the name Auraria, from the Latin for gold, and it was that name that stuck. The town was served by a newspaper, the Western Herald. In addition to the stores and other mining-related businesses, churches and schools were built to serve the families of the miners. One of the prominent citizens of Auraria was Agnes Paschal, also known around town as Grandma Paschal. She was the widow of a Revolutionary soldier who moved to town and set up a, quote, house of entertainment, close quote, otherwise known as a tavern. However, Grandma Paschal was a devout woman and a staunch prohibitionist. She was instrumental in establishing the First Baptist Church in the new town. According to historian Coulter, quote, Grandma Paschal had a good reason to hate whiskey, for it made miners drunk, and drunken miners boisterously broke up our church gatherings." Close quote. Therefore, her tavern sold no strong drink, but did provide food and lodging. Coulter also stated that when John C. Calhoun was in town, he preferred to stay at Paschal's Tavern. Grandma Paschal's Tavern also served as a gathering place for the town. Until separate buildings were constructed, her tavern at various times held church services and served as a school. Auraria was incorporated as a town in 1833 and set up its first post office. The town limits were a circle 1 mile in diameter. However, its, quote, location on a ridge made town planning difficult beyond stringing it out in one long street atop the ridge, close quote, according to Coulter. Coulter went on to say, quote, boom towns were always of flimsy construction, and Auraria was no exception to this rule. Some of the buildings in Auraria fell down within the first year of their construction, close quote. Despite the flimsy construction, Auraria continued to prosper and served as the county seat for Lumpkin County for a brief time. Shortly after the town was incorporated, the Lumpkin County Courthouse was moved to a more level, approachable site about 5 miles north of Auraria. Around the new courthouse, the town of Dahlonega sprang up, which also thrived from the gold trade. The new town siphoned off some of Auraria's businesses, especially attorneys, as government activities moved to Dahlonega. In 1838, the U.S. Mint was established in Dahlonega. Many of the assaying services from Auraria moved to be closer to the Mint. As Dahlonega prospered, Auraria declined. The gold mines were still producing, but interest was drawn elsewhere. In 1848, gold was found at Sutter's Mill in California, resulting in the California Gold Rush. That same year, miners discovered gold at Pikes Peak, Colorado. Many of the Georgia miners left to find their fortunes in the West. The Russell family from Auraria settled near the gold mines in Colorado in 1858. Green Russell named the village that grew up around their settlement Auraria, after their hometown in Georgia. Auraria would merge with the nearby village of Denver City to become the modern city of Denver. As for Auraria, Georgia, businesses continued to leave. The gold fields eventually played out, and more residents headed west. It was during this exodus that assayer Stevenson made his proclamation from the Dahlonega courthouse balcony, pointing at the surrounding mountains and shouting, "Why go to California? In yonder hill lies more riches than anyone ever dreamed of. There's millions in it." That speech was the source of the phrase, "There's gold in them thar hills." George Paschal visited his mother Agnes in 1858 and noted that the town had fallen greatly into decay. Grandma Paschal died in 1869, one of the last of the original settlers of the town. In 1896, a geologist visited the former town to assess the remaining gold and possibility of further mining. According to Coulter, the geologist wrote, quote,
"Now the place is barely a shadow of its former self. Decay has settled like a pall on the few houses left to tell the tale of its bygone activity. A post office and a small country store, one or two other small stores which, with the first, supply the necessities of life for the immediate neighborhood, and probably half a dozen small dwellings, with a number of untenanted houses too far decayed for human use, is all that is left of lively Knucklesville of the 40s.
Close quote. Today, there's not much left of Auraria but the name and its legacy as the first gold rush in the United States. There are a few old buildings remaining on Castleberry Road. Woody's store is the most prominent of these, a two-story, unpainted structure that had been open until the 1980s. There is also a wooden building that had served as a bank and several old houses. Dahlonega is a thriving town with a lively town square. The town's history as a gold mining center is celebrated throughout the city. The old Dahlonega courthouse, built in 1836, sits in the middle of the town square. It's now the Dahlonega Gold Museum Historic Site. The town sits not far from the Etowah River. A couple of miles downstream from the Castleberry Road Bridge is another remnant of gold mining days. At some point, a mining operation significantly changed the course of the Etowah River. In a deep bend of the river, they cut a tunnel through the mountain to divert the water. Then they built a dam to force the water into that tunnel. That essentially left the river bend high and dry so that the miners could extract the gold from the riverbed. Apparently, that operation didn't pan out, pun intended, and no gold was found. The dam was removed, and the river now flowed through both the tunnel and around the bend. As a kayaker, this has been a boon. Under the right conditions, you can paddle the old Etowah mine tunnel, and it's quite the thrill. There are 3 rapids inside the tunnel. The first drop is the smaller of the two, followed by a second, larger drop. At the end of the tunnel is another rapid.
What's that?
I was able to do this a couple of years ago with some friends, and it was a rush. The rushing water sounds different in the tunnel. When I entered the tunnel, my lights were kind of screwed up, and I couldn't get my bearings. My headlamp was set to red, and wasn't bright enough to see what was ahead. I could only see the proverbial light at the end of the tunnel. I hit the first drop blind, but made it through with no problem. I managed to get my light fixed just as I reached the second drop and was able to negotiate it perfectly. The rest of the tunnel was just swift water until I got to the end. At the end of the tunnel, I had to do some maneuvering to avoid some rocks sticking out from the sides of the walls. Again, I made it through with a nice set of standing waves to end the trip. I didn't find any gold. I was a bit busy. If you're not a kayaker, there's still lots to see and do in the old Georgia Gold Rush region. There are still buildings like Woody's store, and the Dahlonega Gold Museum is definitely worth a visit. Even the hills of North Georgia are scenic enough to warrant a visit to the area. That's it for this episode. There are links to the information I used for this episode, including Merton Coulter's book about Auraria. As always, subscribe to the show and leave us a review. Thanks for listening.
In this southern ghost town, we found a story untold. In the shadows of the past, we unravel, secrets unfold. With each step we take, we journey back in time. In this southern ghost town, we leave our footprints behind.
Thanks for listening. The opening music was composed by Lex FM with additional music from Pixabay. The song Southern Ghost Town was generated by Suno AI. All other music was composed and recorded by me, Tom Taylor. Carolina Ghost Towns is a part of the Random Connections empire. It's pretty much a one-man show, so I wear all the hats, including producer, writer, researcher, sound engineer, publicist, and bartender. If you like the show, please subscribe on your favorite pod venue and be sure to give us feedback. If you have questions, comments, or ideas for the show, you can reach me at carolinaghosttownspod@gmail.com. For more information and show notes, visit randomconnections.com. Thank you.
In this southern ghost town, we found a story untold. In the shadows of the past, we unravel, secrets unfold. With each step we take, we journey back in time. In this southern ghost town, we leave our footprints behind.